welcome to this special Monkcast with the Monks. We've mustered the analysts to chat current events and open source because there's been a lot happening in recent months. My name is Kate Holterhoff, Senior Analyst at RedMonk, and instead of me handling guest introductions, to quote Winifred Sanderson in Hocus Pocus, Monks, make thyself known.
I'm Rachel Stevens. I am the Research Director at RedMonk.
So I'm James Governor. I'm co-founder of RedMonk, and I'm all about developers.
I'm Steve O'Grady, co-founder of RedMonk.
I love the idea that we've been mustarded. That sounds very yellow and good.
Mustard is one thing, but Hocus Pocus is quite another.
Do you not like Hocus Pocus?
It's the worst movie. It's the worst movie that's not Frozen.
I thought it was like a nice spooky movie. I thought you'd be into that. It's up in your neck of the woods. It's New England.
It's horrible.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I'll lay out a quick agenda of subjects to be covered for this special recording. In no particular order, we are going to talk about the Nats relicense kerfuffle with the CNCF. Redis is open source again. And to be a bit meta, we're also going to discuss Steve's recent post on the RedMonk website, quote, open source, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, which he published on May the 6th, as well as Rachel's conversation with Brian Cantrill, Adam Leventhal, Adam Jacob, and Eliza Weissman on Oxide and Friends. And in that episode, which was published on the 1st of May, they discuss how there is a shootout at the CNCF Corral, which is probably a better title than I'm going to come up with for this episode. So Nats, CNCF, Redis, where do we want to start?
Man,
Steve,
I don't
where
know.
do we want to start with these?
I mean, I don't really want to start with any of it.
Apparently, this is about licensing and open source, Steve.
Yeah, it's my favorite subject. Well, in the spirit of ripping the Band-Aid off or putting the bad news first, I think we might as well talk about Nats and CNCF. Rachel, you did a good job of running through the particulars on the Oxide podcast. I don't know that we need to get all the details, but do you want to sort of just lay out the basic series of events?
Yeah, so I would say the basic series of events is Nats is a project within the CNCF landscape. It is an incubating project, so it's an established project within the CNCF, and CNCF is an open source foundation for those who are not aware, meaning that it is a consortium of projects, vendors, users who have come together to support projects and have them come to be governed in a vendor-neutral way and have them be sustained in a vendor-neutral way. And the primary backer of the Nats project is a company called Synadia. Synadia donated the project 7 years ago? 7 years ago, I believe. And in the interim, as per their recent claims, has said that they are not having the returns that they expected to have, not having the contributors that they expected to have, and wanted to pull the project back into Synadia and have it not be open source again, which the CNCF and ecosystem obviously strongly objected to. There was a large pushback there, and in recent weeks, they apparently have come back to the negotiating table.
Even the professional CNCF haters were very, very angry about this. So,
well, I mean, not all of them.
Not all of them, but there is one. There is one notable CNCF hater who, in fact, had a different view. That's true.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, I don't think we need to, theoretically they come back to the sort of table and all is putatively well with Synadia and the CNCF and so on. And that's great. Certainly that's a much preferred outcome to lawsuits and so on. And I think the thing that I struggled with this was that there are a couple different layers to this, right? There's the layer of what is the CNCF's value to companies that are contributing either project money or both. And certainly on the Oxide podcast, I think there were real and substantive questions asked about that. Those are fair questions to ask, certainly of every foundation. There are questions in terms of on both sides of the logistics in terms of how things were handled, particularly with respect to the Nats trademark itself, which sort of came to issue with MLB, with the Nationals. So there's that layer as well. But for me, I think the thing that I really struggled with, with some of the reactions, to James's point, most of the reactions that I saw, even amongst people who have no real love for the CNCF, were like, hey, yeah, you can't do this. To me, all of the other questions are secondary, right? So in other words, forget Synadia, forget Nats. If you are a vendor and you come to a foundation and you willingly submit your project, you go into that knowing what the trade-offs are, right? You go into that knowing that you are giving up control, you are giving up trademark, you are donating a project in search of some return. Now, whether you get that return or not, to me is not material. Like, you go into it knowing that this is a one-way door that you cannot exit from, because the analogy that the Oxide folks used was like a marriage, right? To me, the more appropriate analogy for a foundation is like the United States. So if you are a foundation and you willingly let a project that wants to succeed, then what you're telling all of the projects in there is that they can also do that. And in so doing, what you're telling essentially all of the people who are relying on the foundation to be a neutral home for a project, that they are not in fact a neutral home. Right. So to me, all of the sort of other things that have come up in this discussion on the other podcasts and so on are fine. There are appropriate times for that. But this was just a really simple yes or no. And this was not a thing so that's the thing, like the suggestions that were made, like, oh, they should let this happen. I'm like, they can't. They fundamentally can't. Like, no foundation can do that, because then you are essentially saying, well, we're a neutral home until somebody decides that they don't want the project to be a neutral home anymore. And that's just not to me, that's a non-starter. So in other words, I was frankly shocked at some of the reactions that were like, no, just let them go. I don't understand why they're not doing this. So I couldn't process that. And so, I mean, the good news for me, as I said at the top, is that seems like some things got worked out behind closed doors. I can't speak for any other monks. I haven't been briefed, so I haven't talked to any of the parties involved here, so I don't know what sort of conversations were had, promises were made, or whatever. But they have avoided, quote unquote, the nuclear option here, right? Which is going to essentially to legal war, right? Over project trademark ownership, et cetera, because that's a bad outcome for everybody. And I'm glad that cooler heads seem to have prevailed. But it was one of these things, like I said, for me, it was just this is not the occasion to debate the individual merits of the CNCF or frankly any other foundation, right? This was an existential question for them and any other foundation, like full stop. So anyway, that's my rant.
It's a good rant. I was interested in the precedent for this. And so everyone keeps talking about Linker D. How did the Linker D situation differ from what Synadia tried to do?
So I think the Linker D, and I think Adam brought this up on the podcast, if I remember right. So Linker D is also in there, and that's Adam's suggestion I thought was appropriate, right? So I'm trying to think of like how detailed. We don't want to go into all the nitty gritty details here; it'll take too long. So the short version is that the commercial organization behind Linker D basically said, okay, we are not going to provide stable builds effectively. So in other words, the code's open source; it's all here. If you want to go build your own stable build and test it, knock yourself out. If you want a stable build that's tested and QA'd and all that, you come to us and you pay for it, right? And that's definitely skirting the line, being a quote unquote neutral home for a project, but it is at least within the spirit, in the sense that the trademark and all that is still retained by the foundation. So the CNCF, certainly my understanding was that they were not thrilled and would not, certainly prefer to see companies follow this path. But that is much better than, put it this way, if you're the CNCF or, again, any other foundation, and you have a choice between, all right, this company, the project's still going to live here, but they're not providing stable builds, versus I'm going to pull my project out and my trademark out, you definitely prefer the former. So, yeah, that's I think the shortest version of the Linker D thing that I can think of.
And if you look in some of the comments that were happening on LinkedIn during this, like the Buoyant was the company behind Linker D, and some of the comments that were coming from CNCF folks were very much in favor of, I would vastly prefer the stable build route. Like, it's definitely a route that.
I mean, it's, look, we have seen, it is, all comes back to the same problem, which is that if you have a project that is available for free, it's hard to get people to pay for that, right? Because here's the project, here's the source, and particularly for providing stable builds, like, hey, I've got what I need, right? And that's not new to foundations. That's sort of the running theme through the history of open source. So people try to find different mechanisms, different levers to get people to pay, right? And Adam Jacobs, for example, is very much in favor of trademark as a lever. and has put a lot of his time and effort around that. And trademark is indeed vitally important as one of the core intellectual property mechanisms that governs a code. And so that's one route. Stable builds is another route. And we've even seen with Red Hat in recent years. So basically saying, all right, we are going to limit our distribution to customers. That's what we consider distribution in terms of, okay, I'm not providing free bits to everyone else. And so in other words, the source code is available and people can incorporate it. But again, it's skirting the line of providing stable builds. So, people are trying to find ways to add, just a little bit of friction, right, while still living up to their responsibilities as an open source project or open source sort of foundation member. And people get creative and they'll try all sorts of different things, right? And to me, like I said, it comes down to, with respect to foundation specifically, right? It's you either have, you have to know going in what you're giving up in return for what you think you're going to get out of it, right? And that's the thing for whether it's Apache Foundation or Eclipse or whomever, right? If you are going the foundation route, you're making a bet effectively that by giving up sole control of a project, you're going to get outsized return or distribution or any number of different returns from that. You may or may not get that, right? It's a bet, but it's a bet you just can't take back.
I think for me, one of the things that happens a lot in these discussions is somebody will come into the comments and they'll say, open source is not a business model. And then they kind of like mic drop and walk away and then fail to actually talk about the nuances of what the business models are and how hard it is to actually make that happen. And it's really hard. It's really hard to make money when you are giving your software away for free. And I think that one of the things that and it's definitely one of the things that came up really passionately on the podcast with Oxide is just this struggle of what do we want to do for some of these projects that are coming into the CNCF, because a lot of the projects that are coming into the CNCF and open source, just foundations in general, tend to be projects that are single vendor backed and they are commercially driven and the people are there because they want to make money. And so I think a lot of these foundations are kind of at a crossroads of what do we want to do to help these projects succeed and thrive when they're not the really big cloud-backed projects. Like, how are we going to sustain some of these littler projects, and how are we going to make sure that they are successful in addition to like the big Kubernetes projects as well?
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and this is not a revelation, or shouldn't be a revelation to most people in software today, which is that the amount of software that's paid for is vanishingly small. Right. We all, to some degree or another, rely on software that is made up of projects that are small, underfunded, don't have a commercial aspect. I'm trying to remember when, this is probably close to a decade ago at this point, but when there was a core vulnerability in SSH, it's like, it's a pretty core project. And it was revealed that no one was funding it, right? Because it's a tragedy of the commons problem sort of, writ large. So yeah, foundations are part of that. Commercial organizations are part of that. I mean, there are systemic issues in open source, right? There are, in terms of where contributions come for, how it's paid for, relying on free labor, sort of, et cetera. And I don't think anyone sort of would really dispute that. Like I said, for me, the question was like, all right, is it a foundation's responsibility to solve that? And I think there are two answers to that. One is, look, they have to make a core value proposition to encourage new donations, right? They have to provide some return in return for what they're getting, right? And so every foundation is going to have to come up with, all right, here's what you get. Here's what we can promise. Here's what the benefit to the cost of sort of giving up sole control. And that's very hard. What can you do, and how do you fund it? And we have had conversations, at least I have, and I can't speak for the other monks. I know, that the Linux Foundation and its subsidiaries like the CNCF catch, in some cases, rightfully so, a lot of flack, for the amount of money and so on. But, when we talk to vendors, they will say things like, hey, look, I may or may not love VLF, or I may or may not love the CNCF, but they help me put on events, or they help me do X, they help me do Y. And that's why they get a good share of my dollars, right? And so, again, as as software people, we can agree or disagree with that. But the fact is that companies are continuing to contribute to these foundations, and they're doing so in many cases because they think they'll get a return, and some get a better return than others. And that's unfortunate, which brings me to the second part of the foundation question, which is, I think there are people who want foundations to solve this problem. And so, foundations cannot solve the fundamental systemic issues of open source writ large. No one can, right? There's no one party, there's no one entity, there's no one body that can say, okay, I'm going to figure out how to make sure that every project gets the amount of money it deserves, regardless of sort of the commercial hooks or incentive in terms of, people might have for paying for it. I don't know. I guess the problem that I have in these is that the conversations around this are nuanced and require nuance to interpret, and they just are never, I shouldn't say never, they're very rarely treated that way. It's most often treated as a foundation's good, foundation's bad. And it's like, there's good, there's bad. And yeah, that's just it's not necessarily a conversation, certainly with the recent kerfuffle. Certainly not conversations that I was seeing.
I think the CNCF has obviously been quite successful in many terms. So if we think about the LF banner, I mean, there are other sub-foundations that are not as successful as the CNCF, and that success, the CNCF comes in a few different vectors. Some are just financially speaking. The hyperscalers do fund and will continue to fund a foundation that supports Kubernetes, OpenTelemetry, so on. I think there is this very good point. It's quite different when it's single vendor, smaller vendors. I think those are the ones that have, or primarily single vendor, those are the ones I think that are least happy. Oh yeah, sorry, other aspects of success is just, yes, financially, the LF is well funded. Organizations around the planet are adopting Kubernetes at scale in production, all sorts of different kinds of organizations, AI companies, startups of all sort of shapes and sizes, enterprises. There are lots of ways we can talk about, I think, the success of the CNCF. And I think it's interesting that it isn't just Kubernetes anymore either. I mean, I mentioned OTel. OTel is obviously just a tremendously successful project vis-a-vis observability. It seems like observability is the sort of the next act of the CNCF. If we look at the events, if we look at the, what all is going on there, it does seem like, it was great fun building out this Kubernetes infrastructure, but we better be better at managing it. And I think that's kind of where OTel is coming in. That's going to be further investment. We certainly see every observability company in market coalescing around that idea. So yes, plenty of success there. I think for the smaller vendors, the CNCF has at times been a little bit sort of, it's interesting for an organization that's as commercially astute as they are. Sometimes they almost come across a little bit academic. Their care, for good reason, is for the project. It is not necessarily for the producers of them, in a sense. And in and around branding, for example, if you're, and this is, partly the challenge we've got as Adam Jacobs talking about the value being in the trademark. Well, if you can't link your company name trademark very effectively on CNCF properties and the ecosystem at large, so that people know that you are the vendor behind the project, yeah, I think that there are some tweaks. Steve, undoubtedly, look, the CNCF is not going to solve all known problems in this area, but could they tweak it to help smaller companies and independent companies become more financially successful by a little bit of making it clearer who's doing the work? And they do some of it, don't get me wrong. They will, give people awards for making contributions. But yeah, I think there is some stuff that they may want to, in fact, they almost certainly are thinking about, given this current shit show, because nobody wants the threat of that legal aspect that you're talking about, Steve. And yeah, I mean, if you look at William from Buoyant, I mean, he was pretty clear. He felt the Synadia thing was not great, but he said some of the AIM's goals made sense to him. So I think it's how you do it. As you say, when you go in, you have to know what it is. But I do think the CNCF is going to have to probably clarify a little bit. Yes, there are benefits, but if we could just be a little bit clearer what they were and make it clearer who's building the software if people are using it. I think that linkage is one that the indies are going to, probably pushing for, and we're likely to see, or we may see some changes in CNCF accordingly.
And I think the frustrating thing in having these dialogues too, right? Like I said, is that they always come out black and white. And I know Rachel said on the Oxide podcast, like, "Hey, I'm put in the uncomfortable position of being the defender of foundations," and to me at least, I don't see it as much as defending the foundations as much as having like a conversation that includes nuance, right? Which is that, are they making mistakes? Is their value proposition perfect? Should it be refined? Sure, right? All of the above. But it's like, to me, it's a yes and that's just a conversation I just don't see happening. So sure, by all means,
Steve, are you arguing there is a lack of nuance in modern discourse?
Weird.
I'm frankly stunned. I mean,
Yeah.
I had not come across this as being an issue.
It's a weird thing, right?
I think the thing that jumped out to me in this whole situation is where community sits in the CNCF right now, because what Derek was arguing is that Synadia is by and large doing all the commits to Nats right now. And it sort of made me question, like, where is community? If the value prop of the CNCF is that it gathers a lot of folks together who want to see a project succeed, he's arguing at the same time that Synadia doesn't have that community, but instead it's like they're doing everything on their own and they're sort of carrying everything on their shoulders. But then at the same time, I guess continue with this nuance conversation, it felt like the CNCF is bringing that community with it, and that is the value prop. And so any community that they have, they can thank the CNCF for helping that along, for bringing that enthusiasm and making sure that folks who attend the KubeCons are there getting excited about Nats. So I guess if I'm thinking about like what is the existential issue that this whole situation is bringing to the fore, to me it's what is community and how does it relate to these particularly smaller projects when it comes to the CNCF?
I think you can think about community two ways. So like the first way you're thinking about community is like a community of developer committers, which I think in Synadia's letter, they said they had like 92% of the commits were coming from Synadia themselves. I believe
Wow.
something in and around there. A couple of other projects I've talked to that I can't name were definitely upwards of 90 themselves. So some of these small ones, like the projects are owned by basically like the commits are coming from the company that submitted the project. So if you're thinking it from that perspective, they are not getting a diversity of committers from coming in from the CNCF. Where you are seeing community, hopefully, from these things is your project is getting attention and marketing, and you are getting put in front of hundreds, millions, thousands, I don't know, a whole bunch of people. You're getting on stage, you are getting attention, and then you are getting hopefully pulled into projects, enterprises, you are getting used, and then hopefully at some point some of these users are pulling you into your work, and then hopefully some of these people convert to paid users, and like hopefully it's kind of that top of the funnel ecosystem that filters down. So I think you have to think of community in two different ways. And so yes, ideally, some of those users would funnel into being people who are then filtering back commits. But I think the other thing about the CNCF in particular is a lot of these are ops and infra projects. A lot of these people are not necessarily going to be throwing together commits. They're going to be people who want to hold the project in and have it. Like, I'm not sure that necessarily everyone here is pulling the project in and wanting it to be or necessarily wanting to be writing code to pull it back in, or push it back into GitHub. I'm not sure there's necessarily a persona overlap there.
Yeah, and that's the thing, like for me, and I think Rachel's exactly correct, I think to look at the diversity between the community of committers versus the community of downstream consumers, right? And I think from a commit standpoint, look, we know, all of us, that every project is different, right? The community, quote unquote, behind, say, Linux is different than the community behind what I referred to earlier, SSH, right? Those are not the same things, right? They're not going to retain the same size communities because of the nature of the project itself. And so I think the difficult reality, particularly for infra projects, is that it is difficult in many cases to attract people who are going to help advance the cause of that software unless there's a clear commercial interest in it for them, right? So, we look at the case of Kubernetes. Kubernetes has essentially become, it's taken the place of sort of what used to be called middleware. Well, certainly when I was coming up, it's essentially the new middleware. And therefore, it offers commercial opportunities, large commercial opportunities for a wide range of organizations. Unsurprisingly, therefore, it's able to attract quite a bit of commit attention from different providers who want to do different things with it and advance the project in different ways because it serves their commercial interests. for a lot of smaller infra projects, same level of sort of commercial interest and opportunity simply isn't there. And so, yeah, so they they're not going to be able to attract necessarily the same levels of commits that other projects are, just by nature of what they are and what they do. It doesn't mean that they're bad. It doesn't mean that it's not a judgment call. It's more of a reality that, like I said, in a perfect world, all infrastructure software that we rely on would be remunerated appropriately. But, like I said, we rely on this almost house of cards at times, right? In other words, I mean, how long ago was LeftPad? LeftPad is not typically, it's not a phenomenal technical achievement, and yet you remove that and all hell broke loose, right? And so I guess what I'm saying is that from a project standpoint, projects aren't all created equal, and some projects, unfortunately, are just not going to attract the contributor side, from a,
And also the question,
in terms of community.
they may not even, I mean, it's an interesting one there because, like, did the team really want a bunch of external contributions?
Yeah, that's a fair point.
Because, a lot of that is a very different model. It, in effect, slows you down. Then, of course, we do get into the fact that everyone and their dog thinks that their pull request should instantly get the attention that it, they feel it deserves. But yeah, I mean, not all projects are amenable to. Certainly, with commercial backers, they're not even looking for external contributors. So, like, I don't know. I mean, here I'd be a little bit cautious. But given, frankly, Synadia's chops are just building software, I mean, were they really out there trying to get third-party contributors? I mean,
I'm not going to assign intentions to Synadia or not, but I do know that lots of people say, like, accepting commits from third parties can take so much more effort than writing your own to try to go through and get it. Like, it's a lot of work to review to get it in your style to make it
great,
manage.
but community has a cost, and I think,
Yeah.
and again, that's a funny one. Had there been a bunch of external committers, then they would not have been in a position to do what they just did at all, because it would have been, I mean, well, then other bad things were likely to that happens. But that's one I think where, again, it's this question: what is community? Are you even looking? Some projects are looking for external contributors, others are not. And when we look around, as Steve says, every open source project is different. Every commercial company doing open source is doing it slightly differently. And look at the data products and sort of the relicensing. Do people care? If there's a lot of external contributors, then yeah, they're definitely going to care. That's where the problems arise. That's where you're likely to see a fork. If it's all single vendor, it's not so much of an issue.
Which actually might be a good segue to talk about the
Segue to
AGPL stuff.
Redis.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. So
Go ahead, Steve.
yeah, I think there's the micro and macro threads here. So so the micro thread is essentially that Redis relicensed itself again. For the, I don't know how many times it is now. Anyway, yeah, a bunch. And so they essentially stepped down from the SSPL, which is a license written in, what did I say? I think it's 2018, 2019, by MongoDB. And I think I how to describe this shortly. So the AGPL, which is what governed Mongo at the time, is essentially the GPL, but it counts in a network context. And what that means is that if you have a GPL, which is AGPL and GPL are both copyleft software, but the GPL stops in a network setting. So in other words, I can host a customized version of the Linux kernel, which is governed by the GPL. I can host that in a network setting, and the license doesn't matter. Like, I don't have to distribute my changes. The AGPL says, no, the network does matter, in fact. And if I'm modifying software and hosting it on a network, I have to make any of my changes, modifications, fixes, improvements, whatever, made available under exactly the same terms. Okay. So the AGPL is what governed Mongo up until 2018. And Mongo was ostensibly facing issues from US cloud providers. That was a lot of the rhetoric at the time. In retrospect, it seemed clear that, in fact, the problem, as it were large Chinese cloud suppliers. I won't go into, like, suffice to say, the AGPL protected Mongo from the Mongo code base from being implemented by AWS. AWS essentially took a look at the license and said, nope. And we're going to re-implement we're going to stand up our own document database using the Mongo API, but using none of Mongo's code. And anyhow, so Mongo sort of came up with this license that's like the AGPL, except that it goes further. It says not only any changes to the project itself, but you have to make any adjacent software, monitoring software, logging software, everything else available under these same terms. So practically speaking, it's effectively impossible to comply with. And they tried to get it through the OSI. That failed. Well, in part because the process, there were a lot of bad actors in that process at the time, but in part because it, in my view, at least, is fundamentally not compatible with the open source definition. So Mongo had this license in this SSPL introduced in 2018. It governs the project to this day. In recent years, other open source databases have taken it up. Elastic took it up. Redis took it up. And interestingly, both of them have now deprecated it. Both of them have now said, well, you know what? This is not an open source license. It's not approved by the OSI. So we're having, some issues with adoption in certain settings where adoption is restricted to licenses that are approved by the OSI. So they looked at the AGPL and said, well, this gives us 95% of the protection that we need. It's also approved by the OSI, so we're going to move forward with this license instead. We have also seen, I can go back and look them up, other commercial companies that have made that move from Apache. So Grafana did this, MinIO did this. They went from Apache to the AGPL. Citadel, meanwhile, did the same thing last month or 2 months ago. So anyway, the gist of it is that it's early, and these are just a couple of data points, but the data points actively suggest that we may be arriving at sort of something of a détente in terms of companies were going to basically face a choice, right? When they wanted additional protections, they could either stick with an open source license or they could go the source available route. Right? So SSPL or BSL, there's a bunch of different versions where the source is available, but it's restricted in either some technical or business way. And what seems to be happening, again, just from a couple of data points, is that even companies that have already gone the source available route, are looking at it and saying, you know what, no, we actually want to be open source. And we're going to go back to the most protective open source license in existence, which is the AGPL. So there are a lot of people who are not fans of the license. The license still is not widely adopted by many projects. Particularly networking companies or large internet companies hate it because they have to make all of their changes available, as we discussed. And yet it is just short of source available. So from an open source standpoint, it's sort of a win, right? In the sense that you're keeping projects that otherwise might not be, you are maintaining them as open source projects. They're, heavily restricted, but they are still counted as open source or have come back to open source from being source available. And so it is, like I said, it's just a couple data points. We'll see if the trend holds, but if it does, this could be something of a win for open source moving forward.
I did not have the AGPL being the license du jour in 2025 on my
Same.
on my.
Well, and it's interesting because we've gone through cycles, right? So and it's
100%.
cycles that are, I sort of joked about this. This is a famous quote of James, is like, the technology industry is a fashion industry. Licenses have really been almost fashion trends. So in other words, if you go back to this early 2000s, overwhelmingly licenses were copyleft and GPL specifically. When you talk to people, when you talk to developers writing these projects, you'd say, oh, hey, did you think through this and pick this license for a reason? And it'd be like, no, Linux and MySQL are GPL, so we figured that's the one to pick, right? And more recently, over the last decade or so, certainly during the last decade, there was a pronounced shift to permissive licenses. So that's
100%.
Apache, BSD, MIT, et cetera, largely driven in part by Kubernetes and a lot of the other CNCF-backed projects who went for these sort of very permissive licenses, allow you effectively to do anything. And they don't pose any of the copyleft restrictions of reciprocity that GPL and its family do. And so we had this shift to permissive licensing. And like I said, commercial open source projects seem to be gravitating more towards more heavily restricted projects in the AGPL specifically.
Permissive licensing cringe? Is that? Sorry, I have 3 kids, so I'm in that whole, if I'm going to talk about, tech as a fashion industry, Gen Z laughing at millennials because they hide their socks in their sneakers is just super funny. Yeah, no, Gen Z, they wear their socks, they pull their socks up. They don't ever wear like the ones that are just like inside your sneakers. No,
ankle socks.
Gen Z, you have to see the socks. Otherwise, it's cringe.
Okay, I will accept your explanation.
All right, so James is saying MIT license is no-show socks. AGPL.
Yeah, I think
Those socks.
I think
all the way up.
I think MIT, see, that's what I'm saying. I think maybe that was like a millennial thing.
Yeah.
And, the shift here is into,
Yeah.
socks pulled
Yeah.
up,
Yeah.
AGPL
AGPL.
is
Socks pull
trending.
up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Now, it's not at all generational in that sense. Or, yeah, I don't know. But it is a fashion and it is a change. And I think Steve's right to identify that AGPL is, if not in the ascendant, it's definitely having a bloody good year, a good 6 months. And, Steve, how many times have we advised people to not do the AGPL?
Well, I mean, to be fair, and we should
And how many
disclose this.
times have
Like,
we advised people not to relicense with a
yeah,
proprietary license?
well, we've
Even
done
more
that, but
times.
also this is important. Going back to our earlier conversation, right? It's worth saying, like, we have had. I have no idea, but the number, it's a large number. We have had a lot of conversations with companies who are creating an open source project, donating something to open source. It's a big part of what we do from an advisory standpoint, and we're pretty skeptical. In other words, like, when we, I think I put this on Blue Sky, but like, there's slides that we use internally prep for VC portfolio companies and companies that want to do open source. The first question is, are you sure? The second question is, are you really sure? All right. Because open source is great and wonderful and so on, but it is, as we discussed, it's very, very difficult to build a business around. So as much as we personally want to see more open source software in the world, and we want that world to continue to grow, when you're thinking about it as a commercial company, there are hard questions you need to ask. Right. And for some of the companies, at least, what they think they need is the additional protections of the AGPL. And to be clear, that doesn't mean that any of the large clouds, to pick examples, can't use it. What it means is that if they are running any modified version of that code, they have to make any of their changes available on precisely the same terms. So if you are small company A running a AGPL project and large cloud B comes in and uses your thing and changes it, makes improvements and so on, you, in theory, get to benefit from whatever the changes they make to the source. And that's these implications of the license. So it is at a minimum having a moment, and we'll see if that moment turns into a larger trend moving forward.
And if we're thinking about trends in open source in 2025 to sort of collect all of these thoughts, we haven't even mentioned Open Tofu. We kind of alluded to Valky. Change, the popularity of the AGPL is a big part of this. Some kerfuffles around foundations. Anything else that we want that we're following when it comes to, open source this year?
Jesus, let's not talk about AI because, that's
No,
obviously
I'm not going to mention AI. The thing
not
that
gonna do that.
I have a piece sort of half written on this. It'll come out hopefully the next week or two. But one of the things I think is going to be the next frontier for me is going to be APIs, right? So in other words, Oracle v. Google essentially established that it is perfectly permissible to re-implement an API via a distinct code base, right? So that is now effectively the law of the land. And I think, when projects hit a certain level of popularity, historically what we've seen is large cloud companies say, okay, well, we're going to pick this up and run with it. And that's why the Mongos of the world are governed by the SSPL. And it's why companies like Elastic have gone from Apache to SSPL, now back to AGPL, to protect themselves, quote unquote, from these large clouds. And I think one of the things that will be moving forward are explorations of, all right, forget the code base. I can figure that part out. I want to re-implement the API and thereby gain access to a given database or whomever, right? I gain access to their client by essentially cloning the API, the gateway into that product. So, like I said, I think there's more on that to come, I guess is the simplest way to put it.
Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and definitely if you want to steal someone's customers, it is an ideal way of going about things. And everybody loves the Mongo API, that's for sure.
Yep, that's one of them.
Well, at the risk of talking about AI, something that has been interesting to me is the role of SBOMs in our AI code-assisted present, I guess. It seems like there's a lot of companies that are worried about that.
I mean, that's something I'm quite famous for, so...
Well, why don't you pick that one up then, James? What are you following?
F-bombs? I'm happy to drop an
He's
F-bomb.
making an F-bomb joke.
I mean,
I got
sorry. Did you say S-bombs? Yeah.
Tried to. Maybe I failed.
Yeah, just for that, James, you gotta articulate S-bombs. Go.
Well, I mean, look, software bill of materials, I think, where we are as an industry right now, or as a culture right now, people are concerned about the provenance of things. Where did things come from? Can we trust those things? That provenance is becoming ever more questionable in an age where we're vibe coding. God, I can't believe I said that.
You did it.
Anyway, let's say in an environment where we're making lots of changes all at once without fully understanding them, and focusing more on what the code does rather than how it does it, how it works, and how it can be sustained going forward. Actually, on that note, what was one of the folks from Turin Tech? She recently just put forward, she said from vibe to viable coding. And I thought that was quite smart. So yeah, if we're moving forward, I think it was Andy. Anyway, so if we're moving forward to viable coding, yeah, the provenance matters. Geopolitics continues to be a thing. So whilst the big vendors are sort of offering indemnification if someone's code makes its way into their code bases and so on, there is no doubt whatsoever that in the age of AI, certainly need to have really good tooling that is much closer to the developer is going to be super important. In and around, I don't know. I'm not sure that SBOM is a market per se in monetary terms. I mean, we certainly saw ChainGuard as they move forward. Hardened images were able to make a ton of money, whereas selling SBOMs not so much. But I don't think we can deny their importance. But I'm also sort of slightly I think from an open source perspective, it's exactly that. All the code is out there. We're going to be generating code that is likely to have snippets of that, and yeah, that's going to be a concern for people. Is that? I mean, is that?
That's good. That's good. Rachel, do you want to close us out with any things that you're following for the next year?
I think there's lots of going to be projects that are, when you talked about Valky and OpenTofu, I think there are going to be these projects that have splintered off of projects like Redis, and we're going to have to watch what happens with those communities as the license has pulled back. I think we'll see what happens with IBM. So OpenTofu forked off of Terraform, which was then, and that was pulled into IBM. And then Valky is a fork of Redis, which was then now just pulled back into an open source license again. And so we'll see what happened to both of those communities now that there are kind of differences in how those main communities are running. That's definitely something we're watching, seeing how things continue to operate in this ever crazy world.
I'm glad we snuck some forks in here, at least at the end, right?
And for a full circle hocus pocus, hocus pocus. We need a full circle hocus pocus, which is
No, we
definitely
don't.
amok,
No.
amok, which is definitely what this podcast was.
That's amazing.
Anyways,
Such a great movie.
Right, that's
subscribe for
fantastic.
more amok.